Welcome, everybody. My name is Lee Stickles. I'm Associate Professor and Head of Architecture here at the University of Sydney School of Architecture, Design and Planning. And I'm really excited to be helping to launch here this series of hybrid lectures, a huge house, which are part of our induction studio in the Master of Architecture, as well as being a public lecture series. So one of the silver linings of our COVID cloud that we've become used to, I think, is this possibility that we can have these online and hybrid events that can draw together disparate geographies, time zones, and even audiences. So I want to say, firstly, a big hello to the students in the induction studio, because for them, as you can guess by the name, this is their very first studio in our Master of Architecture. So a big hi, folks, to the students. And also a really warm welcome to those of you who are forming our public audience this evening, wherever you are and whatever the context. We love that you can join us for this. I also want to offer a hearty thanks to the studio coordinator, Guillermo Fernandez Abascal, for his work in assembling this lecture series. Guillermo's only recently joined the school, but I think what I think is a good indicator of his enthusiastic and collegial energy that he's bringing to us, he's already whipped up a thoroughly international and compelling lecture series with a set of really interesting practices. Also, a big thanks to our school's events team, a small group of very talented folk who make sure these things run as smoothly as possible, no matter how complex we academics like to make them. I think we're going to have a great discussion tonight, for sure, and in coming weeks, that crosses interests in architecture, the question of housing and its broader role in the city, the way that Guillermo has framed both the studio and this public lecture series. So that is housing as the detailed, concrete making of dwellings, but also housing as a more complex barometer of our collective negotiation of what urbanity means and offers in a given historical moment. And doing that particularly through this lens of student housing. Before we get going though, firstly, I need to make an acknowledgement of country. Which as usual in these times is a little more complex than we were maybe once used to. Before we begin the proceedings, so I would like to acknowledge and pay respect to the traditional owners of the land on which the studio meets, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. It's on their ancestral lands that the University of Sydney is built. I also want to pay respect and acknowledge the traditional owners of the land from which I'm beaming into this conversation from. I'm on Bilia Noongar Budja, which is the country of the Noongar people of the Swan Coastal Plain in Western Australia. So as we share our knowledge, teaching, the learning and research practices within this university, and I'm thinking of the broader context here, Christian and Jörg beaming in from overseas. I want to pay respect to the knowledge embedded forever within the Aboriginal custodianship of country. All right, so now I really need to introduce tonight's guest speakers. And we have Christian Scheidegger and Jörg Keller. They are the partners of Swiss practice Scheidegger Kelly, formed in 2009, as I understand it. And I'm going to give you the sort of the potted history so we can hear more from them. As a very brief background, I just wanted to note that Christian and Jörg both studied architecture at ETH Zurich in the late 1990s to early 2000s. And since then, they've both collaborated with Christian Keres in practice. And after forming Scheidegger Keller, they continued that relationship in roles as teaching assistants at ETH Zurich. They've also both been workshop leaders at Porto Academy. So there's a long history here of collaboration, I guess. Key projects for the practice so far include House with Two Columns in Villain, House on a Slope 1 in Gordola, multifamily houses at Zwickstrasse in Bern. And very pertinent to tonight's discussion, the student housing project Areal Rosengarten. In 2015, they were awarded the Bauwelt Award, and in 2017, the Concrete Award, among many others. They can tell you more, and they can tell that story much better than I can. So I think Christian's going to make the presentation tonight, and then they'll both respond to our questions. So enough from me. Let's hear from them. Christian, Jörg, I'll hand over to you, and welcome.
Welcome, everyone. So let me see. You see the first slide? Okay, thanks a lot that we can talk about our work we do in Switzerland, in Australia. I think it's quite an amazing thing for us. And I think it's also nice to talk just about one project so we can focus and have a close look on the house with loggia and halls. I think, yeah, we will talk about, on one hand, on the typology of the student house, what is in a way characteristic on student housing, also compared, for example, to other housing programs. And of course, when we talk about the typology, the context always has quite a strong impact. So it's not only about question of program, it's also about the context, the topography, the laws, physical context, and so on. So you see the house is located in Zurich. In the background, you see the Swiss Alps, the lake, and it's on a slope. So the question is, how can you place, for example, a long house on such a topography, what is not so easy because of, for example, building heights. Then another aspect, what is very important for the apartment type is the street. It's one of the busiest streets in Switzerland, with around 58,000 cars a day. So it's like a river of traffic passing by the house. That's why it's also in Switzerland quite well known, because everyone passed by and everyone know this house. And of course, with the traffic, also the question of how do you deal with the noise becomes very important. Noise in general has quite a strong impact of how you design houses, because there are quite a lot of rules depending on how rooms are orientated. And another aspect, what was important for the design, is that in the brief was also asked for a public space. So it's not only about designing a house, it's also designing a space for the public. So what you see here is a scheme from the government. We call it like a test planning they do before a competition to check out if it's possible to handle the program on this plot. And for us, it's always quite nice to show it, because it gets clear in a way where are the difficulties, what questions are asked, and it also helps us to know what we don't want. So in a way, as design as a critique in a way. So what you see here, on one hand, it shows the problem of the street, the noise. So everywhere where it's red colored, you're not allowed to ventilate a room. And each room you have, like living room or individual room, needs to be ventilated towards the green. So where it's quiet. So at the end, the diagram shows it precisely what happened, that you start to come up with this comp structure. What has, for us, it's quite a difficult urban setting, because it's not clear anymore where is a public space and where is a private space. Where is the public space ends and where it starts, because you get this kind of spaces in between. So for us, it was clear we don't like to think about the comp structure. And the other thing, what it shows, it's more the program. The student housing in Rosengarten is a flat shared concept where 7 to 8 students share an apartment. They live there, I would say, they have their kitchen, they have 2 bathrooms. And what is interesting when you think about student houses in this flat shared, you have quite a lot, a high number of rooms. You have, for example, you have like 7 rooms. So this is a ratio of 1 to 7 compared to the living room. For example, when you look at the family housing, you have a ratio of 1 to 3, or when you look at elderly people, you have a ratio of 1 to 2. And so this relationship between an individual room or like a private student room related to the living room is totally different and quite unique. So it's a question you have to think about this spatial relationship between individual rooms and communal space inside an apartment. And of course, but it's also a question is about how you circulate when you have so many rooms. For example, here you see you have a kind of a living room, and then, for example, you have a corridor. And of course, a corridor architectonically is not really an interesting element inside an apartment. So that leads us to this scheme. This is, I think, this kind of structure we don't want because of urbanistic reason, and we don't like the corridor. Another scheme you see here, you just have an array of individual rooms towards the park, and then a living room towards the street where you ventilate this way. It's a problem, you get a really like stretched living room, what we also don't like so much. So we decided in a way to stack the rooms on top of each other. And the interesting thing is suddenly you don't have a corridor, you will get a gallery, and instead of having one long space, you get a double high space here. And then it's a certain trick we're doing, is we're shifting the room number 7 towards the street and ventilating towards the park. So you get another double high space here. and all rooms can get ventilated towards the park. So this is in a way the logic of the apartments in the student house. You see it here, it's drawn a little bit more precisely, what I explained here already. So it's a maisonette type on the ground floor, and on top of it, we stacked just the same type again. So you have two maisonette types on top of each other with exactly the same floor plan, but were different in section. Because of the building law, there's a limited of 3 floors, and then you need to build a roof or an attic. So we decided to design an attic, a pitched roof, because the interesting thing on a pitched roof is how I said that you have exactly the same plan like in the apartment below. So there's in a way no structural exception. The only difference is that the space gets the vertical element here, gets almost 10 meters high. In the rooms around 7 meters, and close to the facade, the space is getting low. The other interesting thing is on this type of a maisonette is where you have the staircase. You can add an additional room here. This is the room number 8, where you can ventilate over the roof again towards the park. So this scheme, I think it's highly efficient, because at the end of the day, to get a certain like a spatial generosity, it's only possible when you have an efficient typology, because otherwise it becomes too expensive. So at the end of the competition, we had the same amount of rooms like the second and third placed, but we had 2 double high spaces inside our apartment. So you see the cross section. I think it's interesting as we designed the house is not only to think in a plan, but especially think in a section, because here the plan is quite a rigid grid almost. I will show it later on, but the spatial freedom is completely in the section. And even you have different plans, you already recognize that the spaces are completely different from the apartment on the ground level to the one under the roof. For example, here you have a normal room here, then here you have one with a dormer. We have some special rooms with, we call it like a snorkel. I don't know if it's correct in English. So you get quite a huge variety of spaces, even it's quite a rigid spatial system. I think what is interesting on student housing is that the student room is a very private. It's like an apartment inside an apartment. And then, of course, the communal space is getting important because it's where all the students meet. In the family, it's the living room. But here are like 7 to 8 people, so they also need like a space what is related to the amount of people who has a certain generosity. And the key, I would say, of the project, or what makes it unique, is the loggia. You see it here. And the loggia is the loggia is like a space 2 apartments share with each other. So while sharing, this space gets doubled in size. And I think it's something what is interesting, especially in student housing, that it makes it possible to share spaces, because the private room is not the apartment, it's the individual room. So for us, this was like a key moment in the competition as we break down the firewall here, connecting these two apartments through the loggia. The loggia is also, let's say, the lung of the house, because the living room here and the kitchen are ventilated to the loggia, and also the room over the kitchen is also ventilated to the loggia again. So the loggia is like the room who makes this typology working. And of course, it's a huge space, 18 students can share. We also place the chimney here, on one hand to cover the single column, but also to place like an element who's like underlining this idea of communal space where two apartments share with each other. I show you some picture from one apartment, and you see that it's just an enormous space for the student. And it's important to understand that, for example, here, you cannot build additional rooms because the rooms would be towards the street, and it doesn't work because of the noise. So always when you have a busy street, you get in a way a lack of program on the noisy side. It also shows you slightly different fates between communal space and the private space. For example, here, when you get out of your room, you're below the gallery. You have a column, you have a stair, and this creates like a buffer between your private room and the living hall here. But it's quite, I think, quite important, not that you just open a door and you're suddenly inside the living room. So you need to, like, how you can deal with these different zones. Show you some more pictures from the apartment. This is the view from the gallery down to the living room. Here, for example, you see the student room under the roof. And this, I think, it's a very special room. It's the room on the top of the staircase, where you can ventilate with this window towards the park. So it's like a room, it's like in a way a result of law, I would say, or a result of purely efficiency. And I think the interesting thing is that this efficiency becomes generous spatially. I think this makes it so, I think I would say like special in a way. And of course, like Nouvelle said already, a big apartment is a beautiful apartment. You can say like a big room is beautiful for everything, because this is a picture we took during Corona. In this apartment, architecture students live. The ETH at the Hönkeberg was closed. So they just moved out their chairs from their individual room, organized their own atelier, and worked in the living room. And I think it's just amazing to see how you can use a huge space or a generous space. It becomes like a public place inside the apartment. Like the city is imploding and the public has to move inside the apartment in this Corona time. So I talked about, like, you recognize we kind of design the student house quite bottom up, starting in a way from, we know what we don't want urbanistically, but then thinking about the apartment. and designing the house bottom up from the single house to the whole building. So you see here quite clearly the structure where the two apartments are stacked on top of each other. And then you have an array from the same apartment with an exception at the end of the building and at the beginning of the building. I think it gets clear here with this, with the rooms towards the park, and then always the living halls to the street and the loggia here, with some exception here at the head and at the end of the building. This is the structure of the building. It's in a way just a simple column slab structure, but makes it easy to react on the topography and also on the structure on the double high spaces. You also see the grid is depending on the single room. It's a grid almost around 3 by 7 meters. The whole building follows exactly the street, so it has a curve with a radius of 1,000 meters. So it always stretches to the park. And this structure is built in concrete, and all elements are just added to it. And they are added like autonomous objects. So for example, the wall is always kind of freestanding. We don't build a corner from the wall. So they're like, it's like an addition of adding elements. In a way, you can see it like the concrete structure is in a way orchestrate all other elements. So this leads to this quite dense joints, for example, you see here, also like constructively, but also spatially. Here you have the loggia and here you have the hall. This is the column who separates these two double high spaces. And the window, the door, everything is just roughly joining. There's another example, just adding these elements over here. You also see, for example, in this corner, it's where the next apartment is coming. So you always feel like small steps of 70 centimeters from one apartment to the other one. And this makes the space lives in a way from these different elements. We also have like a critical mass for this kind of bricolage, because like we have a stair, we have here a wall for the acoustics. You see, for example, here the door, who is the whole height of the doors, so that we don't need to build corners with the brick wall here. And it gets a certain density of different material and different elements who gets quite good together with the furniture from the students and the life in there. There's some other pictures, and you see it, you get quite dense. Before we saw this corner here, you get this dense joints, but on the other hand, you get these huge surfaces who makes this also in detail, who makes this apartment so generous. Then some last words maybe to the facade. Facade is just built completely in brick. brick because it's like quite a stable material related to the pollution from the street, but also it's a heavy material to deal with the noise problem we have. So we decided to build the whole house in brick. And the facade, I think it's a slightly shows the logic from the apartment quite straight. You always see the loggias here. So an apartment is going from here to here. Then of course you always have the step where the building can follow exactly the terrain. You see the rooms just following on top of each other. And then the chimneys they're always placed on an urbanistic, some urbanistic thoughts. For example, here, this one is parallel to the street here. So it helps to fix the building inside this open space. Then you have 3 chimneys here, and the last one is already rotated again. So all the elements like the row house, the chimney, the loggias, we are using to set the building precisely into its urban context. You see it also here where the building also follows exactly the street with this curve of radius of 1,000 meter that it's fits precisely into this street space. So that's it already. I'm outside, and I think in time I should be okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Let's bring Kate from the panelists and she's gonna go with the question. It was great. Thanks very much. Hi, Kate. Now you go ahead.
Hello. Thank you very much. I might just share some response. A long house of 4 levels in Zurich is a perfect example of what Roger Diener taught us, that in the European context, housing is the basis of the city. This means that the house, in this case a huge one, has a responsibility to have an urban project. On this site, the harsh, noisy street to the north and a quiet neighbourhood park to the south is now shielded by this wall of housing. Chimneys evoke the earliest public housing, the British kind, the subject of Engels' housing studies and later Rossi's analogous architecture. But here the chimneys as high as the ridge do more than representation. As a formal device, they mediate the stepping in the facade due to the fall of the site, and they give rhythm to the street on an otherwise long and monolithic row. On the street side, the pairing of dormer windows match the neighbours up the road and perform the same role, grouped in pairs along party walls. The scale of a single house is subtly expressed. But before you perceive the volume, you perceive the red. Is the brick too much? Probably, and they are real bricks too, 70 millimetres thick. Perhaps the red roof overwhelms and creates oppressive monolithic volume, but it's nice when the brick turns the corner to wrap inside the loggia, contrasted nicely with the concrete ceiling and floors. And then it becomes sculptural with steps and a massive hearth. It's as though there is brick for the street and brick for the interior. In contrast to the individualism of Dutch and Australian housing projects, colour here unifies the collective expression of a multi-person house. In our own cities, so in Australia, where the product called higher education to students from other countries is our second largest export, we might imagine a representation in the city through housing projects such as these, much like the attempt to dignify the working class housing through the estrangement of bourgeois architectural elements of the Red Vienna project. Instead of being dispersed and invisible, students could be represented through their housing. And lastly, instead of a balcony attached to the envelope in wind and weather, a loggia of equal size and proportion to the kitchen contains a hearth. An archaic moment in the contemporary city is okay, I think. Inside, the British again, this time in rose garden ornamentation on the floor slab of the living room. I think it's funny when the Swiss try to ornament. I imagine that it must be as successful as their humor. I don't think we need an excuse beyond the direct and robust beauty of this project. But if there is one thing we have learned in the last 30 years, it's that the Swiss know ambiguity. Look at these 6 rooms of equal size and proportion at 3 to 5. Each room has equal access to views and light. No fixed joinery. They accommodate a bed and a desk for students now, but we don't have to stretch our imagination to imagine their use by other subjects of collective housing. We should imagine that the program of a building will expire before the building does. And these houses do that. Every form of life is conceivable. And it's not just in the plan, it's in the materials and details that do not speak of a specific person. They all share a mezzanine and stair, and the grouping of students happens at numbers of 7 to 8 within the apartment and within the loggia of up to 16. And to me, this seems to be a realistic scale of a workable community. I want to live here. And I can imagine with the rise in one-person households, this long, huge house is a model for now. Thank you.
Thank you.
Christian, George, you need to answer with your humor or with your ambiguity. We don't care. But Kate was a great, I think, reflection on this. I don't know if Christian and George have something or the long shot doesn't require much answer.
I was not expecting this somehow.
Neither was I, don't worry.
No, we expected to have precise questions. So somehow like they're woven in between sentences and stuff. You somehow raised questions and I would not know I would not know exactly where to start off.
I think I love the quote that students wrote this, isn't it?
No,
you wrote it. That you like to live in there. I think that's in a way the most important thing. On one hand, to create space where the people like to live in there, but also to create space what is for the public. So that's why we liked, for example, the loggias, because the loggia is part of the, it's an outdoor space, but it's part of the building. It's not like a canopy, and there's in a way quite a clear border between private outdoor space and public outdoor space. So for us, it was important not that the public space becomes a garden of the student house. This was the ideas, for example, towards the park. And then of course, on an urbanistic way, the street is super important that we have the living rooms on the street. So when you walk along the street, or you're sitting in your car, you see the life inside the student house. And it's really beautiful that the windows are always like open, Like you can see inside the apartments. Sun protection is never down because it's toward the north, and the students don't care when someone is looking inside. So for the street, it's just super nice to see the life inside the house, not that the facade, the noisy facade gets closed with super small windows. So when you do the apartment, it's always related to its context.
Why do you think the spatial models of the hearth and the hall and the loggia, how do you find them appropriate to a contemporary way of life? For example, would they use the fireplace, the students?
I mean, at least we have a close contact to the community, like the architectural students, and they definitely do use it. Honestly, I've never seen it like we always wanted to burn some, I don't know, like something there that you could really see the smoke coming up, like from far away from somewhere else in the city, but we never managed to do it. No, but I think they use it. And I think it's always like, it's quite often it's like this. It's just you offer something that they can sort of occupy or they can use. I mean, I think you can also use the space just without using, I think you called it the hearth, right? We're always not so sure if we should call it hearth or if it's a fireplace. Hearth always, to my understanding, sounds a bit more warm or like cozy, let's say, which I sort of like. No, but I think, I mean, at the end, what's the most important part of it? It's this balance between private and public, or let's say private and communal, which was super important. And I think the hearth or the fireplace sort of intensifies this idea of community or of a space where people would gather and do stuff. And therefore, I think it's quite a nice opportunity to have it, I think. And what you maybe also, you also addressed this idea of the dealing with, there's this thin line of how you approach a certain scale that is maybe much more in reference to a house, but it's still an adding of houses which gives you what you call a huge, I mean, we would not dare to call it a huge house, but it's, for our understanding, it's a big one at least, and it is the biggest we've done so far. And so it was always a bit how much you dare to sort of address sort of a bigness or like a generosity and stuff like that. And to be, I mean, for example, the fireplace, as you've noticed, the chimneys are quite high, and it's also the thing. It's just a building rule that says it has to be 50 centimeters higher than whatever is within a radius of 10 meters, which is obviously the ridge. So therefore, it had, in the competition, it was quite low, but then finally we ended up having it even higher than the ridge, which we liked very much, because it really gets sort of a nice presence, also in opposite of this communal, or let's say the public space adjacent to it. Yeah.
And I think what is like this, the way, I think there are different kind of student housing. Some students, they live in their own apartment or in their own room. They have a kitchen and a toilet, a bath inside their own apartment. I think here it's interesting that the students, they share the kitchen, they share the bathroom, and they share this loggia. And this makes it quite efficient. So, for example, each student has a 25 square meter per person. Normally in Switzerland, we're around 40 to 45 square meter. And I think when you start to share rooms. I think it's interesting that it can get doubled. And I think the loggia shows this space is only, I think it's only possible, for example, in student housing. In family housing, it can be quite difficult already. You know, the subject, for example, you have a long balcony, and then you have to separate the balcony, that the cat is not going from one apartment to the other one, or the kid goes there, and privacy is a big issue. But here, I think student housing is more, in a way, it's more open. But I think it's also interesting, like in our time, we talked a lot about like sharing things. You don't need to own everything. And that you get more when you're sharing. I think it's quite successful in this loggia.
So maybe it's I think it's great maybe to finish with that, the importance of the loggia and how student housing can be the ultimate typology to test contemporary life, because it's the perfect one to figure out how we want to share things. And I think today was incredibly clear. And also it can be a huge house with urban ambitions, because yours also has urban ambitions. And I think that was very clear. And I hope the students also understood why we have been speaking about this particular typology, this particular project. And I think we will share, some of you maybe copy some of your arrangements, which I think is good to do it. Some of them maybe only have the loggias as a double way to share double rooms. And I think we will try to see how this evolves, because that's the idea that also some of the students take things from her. Christian, Jürgen, it was great to meet you, even if it's virtually, and maybe join us tomorrow to discuss with Philman other huge houses, in this time, a village. And thank you everybody for joining us. Thanks, Kate Finning, and thanks, Elias Stickles, for introducing the series. And see everybody tomorrow at 6:30. And thanks again, as Liz said, to Steve and Adrian from the School of Architecture at the University of Sydney for organizing this. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jürgen.
Thanks, you, Christian, Kate.